His message came through. Same time Thursday, second floor. And I didn't hesitate the way I should have. I just stood there on that sidewalk in the cold, reading it twice, and then I kept walking. That was 3 days ago. Thursday is tomorrow, and I still haven't decided what I'm walking into. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This channel grows because of you, and it genuinely means a lot. Now let's get back to Zoe and Tate, because part 2 is where things stop being simple. Thursday came faster than I wanted it to. I showed up at 8:55, 5 minutes early the way I always am, and told myself the whole walk over that this was professional, that I was here to finish a job, that the fact that I'd changed my shirt twice before leaving the apartment meant nothing. The second floor was different from the entrance hall. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, the kind of space that felt more lived in, even though nobody had lived there in years. Old bookshelves still lining one wall. A window seat with the original cushion, faded to almost nothing. I set my bag down and started working without waiting for him, which felt important. He arrived at 9:15, no explanation for the delay, just walked in and said good morning, and set his coat over the back of a chair like he'd done it 1,000 times. We fell into something that resembled a routine. Me moving through the rooms, him nearby without crowding, occasional short exchanges about the building, the light, nothing that meant very much on the surface. But the air between us had changed since Tuesday. Something had shifted in the quality of the silence, made it heavier, more aware of itself. Around 10, he came to stand beside me while I was framing a shot of the window seat. And without thinking, I said, "Don't move," because the light had caught him in a way that was compositionally interesting, and my instincts reacted before my brain could stop them. He went still immediately. I took the shot. Then I lowered the camera and felt the heat rise in my face before I could stop it. "Sorry," I said. Reflex. "Can I see it?" I turned the camera screen toward him. He looked at it for a long moment. Not at himself exactly, more at the room around him, the way the light fell, the empty shelves behind him. Then he said, quietly, "You see things differently than most people." "It's just framing," I said. "No," he said, "it's not." He was close enough that I could have taken a small step back and created comfortable distance. I didn't. That was its own kind of answer, and we both knew it. He looked up from the camera screen, and his eyes met mine, and stayed there. And for a moment, neither of us said anything, and the room felt very small and very warm for a building with no heating. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something in his expression tightened. Not quite irritation, something more complicated. He took the call, moving toward the far window, his voice dropping low and controlled in the way it did when he was managing something. I went back to work. But my hands weren't entirely steady, and I couldn't pretend the moment hadn't happened. When he came back 10 minutes later, his face was composed, but the ease was gone from it. I didn't ask. He didn't explain. But before I left that afternoon, he said, without quite looking at me, "There's an event Saturday, industry thing. I'd like you to come." I looked at him. "As your photographer?" The pause before he answered was just long enough to mean something. "If that's what you need it to be," he said. I said yes. I told myself it was because the event was a legitimate networking opportunity, the kind of room I'd never get into on my own, full of people who hired photographers for exactly the kind of work I was trying to build toward. That was true. It was also only part of the truth, and by Saturday evening, standing in front of my mirror in the one dress I owned that felt appropriate for something like this, I stopped pretending otherwise. The event was in a restored ballroom in Midtown. the kind of space that made you stand up straighter just by walking into it. I arrived on my own, camera bag over my shoulder, and spent the first 20 minutes working, moving through the crowd, documenting the room, giving my hands something to do. Tate found me near the far end of the hall. He was in a dark suit, no tie, and he looked so entirely at ease in a room full of people competing for each other's attention that it was almost irritating. He handed me a glass of champagne without asking and said, "You look like you're trying to disappear." "I'm working," I said. "You've taken maybe 4 shots in the last 10 minutes, he said. He wasn't wrong. We stayed close for most of the evening, not attached. He moved through conversations with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this since childhood, and I didn't follow him, but we kept finding each other again across the room, the way you do when you're paying more attention to one person than you mean to. At some point, his hand came to the small of my back, briefly, lightly, guiding me slightly to the left to make room for a passing server. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I felt it for the rest of the night. Then Marcus arrived. I didn't know who he was at first, just a tall man in an expensive suit who approached me with a smile that was too wide and too immediate, the kind of smile that had learned to look warm without being it. He introduced himself as an old friend of Tate's, asked about my work, asked how I knew Tate, and something about the way he asked made the back of my neck prickle. Tate appeared beside me within minutes. The two men greeted each other with the surface pleasantness of people who had history they weren't discussing in public, and I watched Tate's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly while his expression stayed perfectly composed. Marcus said something about the Mercer group, something about a property deal that had apparently not ended well, and then looked at me and said, smiling, "Just be careful with this one. He tends to get what he wants." The comment was casual, delivered like a joke, but it landed differently than a joke, and all 3 of us knew it. Tate said nothing. Later, when Marcus had moved on, I turned to Tate and said, "Old friend?" He looked at me steadily. "Old problem," he said, and something in the honesty of that, the fact that he didn't dress it up, made me trust him slightly more than I had before, which scared me more than Marcus had. We left the event together without really deciding to. The night had gotten cold, the kind of sharp, dry cold that makes the city feel cleaner than it is, and we walked for half a block before either of us said anything. I had my camera bag on one shoulder, and my heels were starting to make themselves known, and I was very aware of how close we were walking, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air. He asked if I was hungry. I said I could eat. We ended up in a small Italian place 2 streets over, the kind of restaurant that's been in the same spot for 30 years and doesn't need to try very hard anymore. A corner table, low light, the quiet hum of other people's conversations around us. It was the first time we'd sat across from each other without the building, without the camera, without a professional reason to be in the same room. It felt different, more exposed somehow. We talked, not about the event, not about work, about other things, smaller things that ended up feeling larger. He told me about a trip he'd taken alone to Portugal 2 years ago, the only vacation he'd taken in recent memory. And the way he described it, the specific quality of light in the mornings, the way the city smelled before the tourists arrived, told me more about him than anything he'd said before. I told him about the year I spent shooting weddings to pay rent, and how it had almost made me stop taking photographs entirely. And he listened the way he did everything, completely, without rushing toward his own response. At some point, the food was gone, and neither of us had noticed. The restaurant had emptied around us, and the candle between us had burned low. And I realized I had no idea what time it was, or how long we'd been sitting there. He was looking at me in a way that had been building all evening, quiet and direct and warm, in a way that his public face never was. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay," I said. "And I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." I felt my pulse shift. "When did this stop being about the job for you?" The question landed softly, but it didn't leave room to hide. I could have deflected. I could have smiled and said something that was technically true, but didn't cost me anything. Instead, I looked at him across that small table in that quiet restaurant and said, "Probably the second Thursday." Something moved through his expression, relief maybe, or recognition. He reached across the table and his hand covered mine, not grabbing, just resting there, warm and steady, and I didn't pull away. We stayed like that for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then his phone lit up on the table between us. He glanced at it, and the warmth in his face shifted. Not gone, but complicated by something I couldn't read. He turned the screen face down without answering. But I'd already seen the name. It was his father. He walked me home. I didn't ask him to, and he didn't announce it. He just turned in the same direction I was walking and stayed beside me, hands in his coat pockets, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to. The city was quiet the way it only gets past midnight on a cold night, just the sound of our footsteps and distant traffic and the occasional rush of wind between buildings. We weren't talking much, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the kind of silence that only exists between people who have stopped needing to fill space with noise. When we reached my building, he stopped at the bottom of the steps. I turned to face him, and we were close. Closer than we'd been all evening. Closer than the restaurant, or the event, or any of the Thursdays in that building had allowed. The light above the door was casting everything in a warm, slightly unreal glow. And I was aware of how he was looking at me, steady and unhurried, like he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to let it happen. He reached up and pushed a strand of hair back from my face, one small, deliberate gesture, and his fingers brushed my cheek so briefly that it could almost have been accidental. It wasn't. "Zoe," he said. Just my name. The way he said it, quiet and careful, like it meant something specific, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in a very long time. I closed the small distance between us and kissed him. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden movement, no desperation. Just my mouth against his, slow and warm, and his hand moving from my cheek to the back of my neck with a gentleness that surprised me, given everything I thought I knew about him. He kissed me back like he had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. And for a moment, the cold and the city and all my carefully maintained reasons for keeping distance dissolved into something much simpler and much harder to argue with. When we pulled back, we stayed close, foreheads almost touching, and I could feel his breath against my lips, and his hand still warm at the back of my neck. "I've been wanting to do that since the gallery," he said quietly. "I know," I said. He laughed, a real one, low and brief, and it changed his whole face in a way that made something ache a little in my chest, because I understood in that moment that not many people got to see it. I went inside feeling warm all the way through, despite the cold. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time without turning the lights on, just sitting with it, letting it be real. Then my phone buzzed, a message from Dana that said simply, "Call me when you get home. I need to tell you something about Tate Mercer." I stared at the screen. The warmth in my chest didn't disappear entirely, but something underneath it shifted, quiet and cold, like a draft coming in under a closed door. I called Dana back immediately. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant whatever she had to say was something she'd been sitting with for a while. She started carefully, the way she does when she's trying not to alarm me and is already failing at it. She'd been at a dinner the night before with a colleague who worked in property law. Tate's name had come up. Not unusually, it came up in those circles the way weather comes up, just ambient background noise. But then her colleague had mentioned something specific, the building where I'd been shooting, the lease on the apartment 2 floors below mine, which had quietly transferred to a Mercer Group subsidiary 3 weeks ago. And the gallery where my show had been. The owner, apparently, had received an anonymous sponsorship that covered the cost of the entire event 2 days before opening night. Dana didn't say anything after that. She let it sit there and waited for me to respond. I sat very still on the edge of my bed in the dark and felt the warmth from an hour ago cooling in real time. I knew what she was implying. I also knew I couldn't dismiss it outright because the pattern was there if you looked for it. The job offer, the building, the gallery. Each one explainable on its own. Together, they formed a shape I recognized, and not from somewhere good. I thanked Dana and told her I was fine and got off the phone before she could ask me any more questions I didn't have answers to. I didn't sleep well. In the morning, I was rational about it, or tried to be. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and thought it through as clearly as I could. The job had been real. The invoice had cleared. The work was legitimate. Nobody had asked anything of me in return. The gallery sponsorship, if it was even true, had benefited 15 artists, not just me. The apartment in my building could have been any number of things, but I'd been here before, not with money on this scale, but with the same architecture. A man arranging things around me without asking, quietly shifting the landscape until his presence felt inevitable. And I had promised myself, with everything I had, that I would never again be the woman who noticed too late. I texted Tate before I could think myself out of it, short, direct. I need to ask you something. Can we meet today? He replied within minutes. I'll come to you. 1 hour. When he knocked, I opened the door and looked at him. Coat, no pretense, the same steady eyes, and felt the horrible complexity of wanting to trust someone and not being sure you should. I let him in. He stood in the middle of my small living room and looked around once, taking it in the way he took everything in, quietly and completely. Then he looked at me and said, "Whatever Dana told you, I can explain." My stomach dropped, not because of what he said, because he already knew. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, arms crossed, and waited. He didn't try to fill the silence with excuses, which I appreciated, even in that moment when appreciation was the last thing I wanted to feel. He sat down on the edge of the couch without being invited and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a second before looking at me. He told me the truth, all of it, without softening the edges. The gallery sponsorship had been his. He'd seen my name on the submission list through a contact and acted without thinking it through. The job had been genuine, the building needed the documentation, but he'd specifically requested my name. The apartment in my building was a recent acquisition and had nothing to do with me, which was either true or the one thing he knew I couldn't verify, and he said so himself. He said, "I'm not going to tell you it was all innocent. It wasn't. I wanted reasons to be near you, and I used what I had to create them." The honesty of it hit harder than anger would have. I walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the street below, thinking about my ex and the way control had always arrived dressed as generosity. Thinking about the woman I'd been at the end of that relationship, smaller, quieter, unsure of her own instincts. Then I thought about every moment with Tate that had felt real. the coffee on the windowsill, the restaurant, the way he'd said my name on the sidewalk like it meant something. I turned around. "If you do anything like this again," I said, "I leave. No conversation, no explanation. I leave." He held my gaze. "I know." "I mean it, Tate." "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm still sitting here, instead of trying to talk you out of being angry." I crossed the room and sat beside him, and for a moment we were just quiet together, the way we'd learned to be. Then he reached over and took my hand, and I let him, and he brought it to his mouth and pressed his lips against my knuckles, slowly, deliberately, with a tenderness that had no performance in it. I leaned into him, and he put his arm around me, and we stayed like that while the morning light moved across the floor. It wasn't a perfect beginning, but it was an honest one. And after everything, that was the only kind I was willing to have. 6 months later, I still take the long way sometimes. Old habit. But now, more often than not, Tate walks it with me. He doesn't rush me, doesn't check his phone every 3 minutes, or make me feel like my pace is inconvenient. He just walks, hands in his pockets, and lets the city be whatever it is that morning. We didn't move in together. We didn't make grand announcements or change our lives overnight. What we did was simpler and harder than any of that. We just kept showing up. For dinners that ran too long. For mornings that were quiet in the best way. For the occasional argument that reminded us both that we were real people with actual edges, not characters in something polished and easy. The photograph, still, ended up on the wall of his apartment. Not because I sold it to him. Because one afternoon, I brought it over and hung it myself, without making a speech about it. And he stood in the doorway watching me and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I still freelance, still take the jobs that matter to me, still turn down the ones that don't, still eat lunch alone at my desk more than I probably should. My life didn't transform into something unrecognizable. It just got warmer, steadier, like a room that finally has enough light. And Tate, the man who removed every reason for me to stay, who arranged the landscape around me with the quiet precision of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, he turned out to be the one thing in my life I chose completely on my own terms. That's the part he still hasn't quite gotten over. Honestly, neither have I. And that's the end of Zoe and Tate's story. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. Drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments and let me know what you thought. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and it means more than you know.